the wake of the decisive Battle at Midway, the Americans had been given the initiative in the Pacific Theatre. With the bulk of the Japanese fleet carriers destroyed and their elite aircrews killed in combat, the IJN no longer had the numerical carrier advantage over the Americans in the Pacific. However, the Americans did not leave Midway unscathed. In December of 1941, the Americans had a total of 5 fleet carriers as opposed to the Japanese 6. However, the Japanese also had a large collection of light carriers. After the Battle of Midway, the Americans only possessed 2 operational fleet carriers and the Japanese had been brought also down to 2. By July of 1942, USS Wasp was brought over from the Atlantic and the USS Saratoga had finished refitting, and the Japanese commissioned the mid-sized carriers Junyo and Hiyo, bringing both fleets to an equal number of fleet carriers. However, the Japanese still held an advantage in the total amount of flight decks they had available, the light carrier fleets having been relatively untouched except for the loss of the Shoho in May. In the early years of the Pacific War, the Japanese had invaded Rabaul in New Britain and established a major naval base there. They would later use this base as a jumping off point for the invasion of the Solomon Islands chain. During the Battle of the Coral Sea, the Japanese landed troops at Guadalcanal and Tulagi and established a seaplane base at Tulagi in coordination with the Operation MO, the attempted invasion of Port Moresby. However, following their disastrous defeat at Midway, the IJN was unable to conduct any major offensive operations and cancelled the planned operations into the Fijian Islands and New Caledonia. This gave the Americans some breathing room to begin their planning of their first assault into Japanese territory. The Americans had to act fast in this small window of time while the IJN gathered its strength once more, so the US created an invasion plan, and this plan was the brainchild of the Chief of Staff of the US Navy, Admiral Ernest King. The operation called for the occupation of Santa Cruz Islands, the Florida Islands and Tulagi. However, when the Americans found out that the Japanese began construction of an airfield on Guadalcanal which, when operational, threatened to cut off supply lines to Australia, Guadalcanal became a top priority. However, getting everything together was still a problem. The US had enacted the Europe First policy, which focused on Germany exclusively, and the US's planned Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa, had already taken up most of the troops readily available. Admiral King had to search for alternatives. He found them when he was given the 1st Marine Division under the command of Major General Alexander Vandergrift, who had his troops stationed in New Zealand in order to counter any Japanese attacks southward. Espiritu Santo Naval Base in the New Hebrides became the base of operations for the newly dubbed Operation Watchtower. This new operation completely removed the capture of Santa Cruz Islands from the to-do list, focusing on Tulagi and Guadalcanal. The Watchtower force, totaling almost 85 warships and transports, including the carriers Enterprise and Saratoga, the cruisers Chicago, Vincennes, Astoria, Quincy and San Juan guarded the landing fleet, joined by Australian warships Australia, Canberra and Hobart. The carrier group was designated Task Force 61 and the invasion fleet became Task Force 62. The fleet gathered near Fiji on the 26th of July and conducted a rehearsal landing before leaving for Guadalcanal on the 31st. Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher had command place on the USS Saratoga after having to abandon the USS Yorktown at Midway, while Vice Admiral Kincaid took command of the USS Enterprise. 16,000 Marines were loaded up onto transports and were ready for battle. However, while this force looked mighty, the troops were inexperienced, along with only being outfitted with outdated weaponry and barely enough ammunition to last them 2 weeks. Because the planners wanted to get the invasion underway as soon as possible, the Marines only received 60 days of the 90 days worth of supplies. Luck was on the American side, however, as the bad weather allowed the invasion fleet to arrive undetected right on the Japanese doorstep. While Task Force 61 had stopped south of Guadalcanal, the amphibious force pressed on, splitting into 2 fleets, Transport Groups X and Y. Both fleets sailed past Sava Island and began to make their approach to their respective islands. Fleet X hit on Guadalcanal, while Fleet Y hit Tulagi. The landing on Guadalcanal became almost unopposed as Major General Vandergrift personally led 11,000 Marines ashore and secured the unfinished airfield by 1600 hours. The terrified Japanese engineers on the island have fled inland, abandoning all of their heavy equipment and food. The equipment allowed the Americans to begin work on finishing the airfield and making it operational. The initial attack on Tulagi came from the air as US aircraft neutralised a seaplane base. All the Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the ground, unable to even start their engines. However, the Allied landings were not as smooth. As soon as the Marines came ashore, they came under fire. The Japanese defenders fought to the last, but Tulagi was eventually secured by August the 8th. Within several hours of the initial landing, the fleets came under attack from Japanese bombers based in Rabaul. Attacking the US fleet was a long-range twin-engine bomber. The G4M2, codenamed Betty by their allies, was an already proven and established aircraft, having helped sink the British battleships in Force Z. It had a maximum range of 2,850 kilometers and a bomb load of up to 800 kilograms or a single torpedo. However, the aircraft lacks any form of fuel tank protection, leading to the Allies nicknaming it the Flying Cigar. However, these Bettys were not alone. They were also escorted by the best Japanese fighter at the time, legendary A6M2 Reisen, codenamed the Zero by the Allies. These aircraft were extremely manoeuvrable and were armed with two 20mm cannons in the wings, as well as two rifle caliber machine guns on the nose. However, much like the Betty, the Zero lacked any meaningful armour protection around the pilot or fuel tanks, which meant that a single well-placed burst could send them down in flames. Defending the fleet was the American F4F3 Wildcat, a complete opposite to the Zero. The Wildcat was built much sturdier and was well protected. The Wildcat could soak up an unthinkable amount of damage and still be able to return home. In one instance, Saburo Sakai, a Japanese ace, recalled putting almost 500 rifle caliber rounds into a Wildcat and it was still able to fly. Due to the Wildcat's heavy weight, American pilots were not able to fight in a classic dogfight and had to resort to boom and zoom attacks on the Zeros, and the excellent 50 caliber machine guns, of which it had 4, had more than enough ammunition to last in long encounters, unlike the Zeros, who only had 120 rounds of cannon ammunition.
We've got bombers incoming. Wildcats are on course to intercept. I got one! He's burning! I'm hit! I'm going down!
More attacks would come the next day as well. However, due to the US fighter cover and strong anti-aircraft fire, the Japanese attacks were relatively unsuccessful, only heavily damaging a single destroyer and sinking a single transport. However, what the attacks lacked in power, they made up for in psychological effect, as Admiral Fletcher began to worry. Having lost 14 of his Wildcats by day 2, he realised that he could not keep this up for long, and if his carriers ran out of fighters, they would be sitting ducks. So, by the evening of the 8th, having made the decision to protect his carriers, he withdrew Task Force 61 from the operational area. The sudden loss of air cover began to concern the commanding officer of the landing forces, Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner, who began to plan a withdrawal as well, even though more than half of the supplies of the Marines were not unloaded. However, he expected something like this to happen, so he planned to unload as much as he could and then withdraw early in the morning. This would later have a disastrous effect, as the Japanese already had a more meaningful response on the way.